Hello and welcome back. So, continuing our survey of epistemology, today we're going to talk about epistemic injustice. So, you'll recall this EPIST, epist is the Greek for knowledge. So, we're just talking about knowledge, kinds of knowledge. And epistemic injustice is a kind of injustice that you can do to someone else or have done to you in virtue of your being a knower, right? So, people can either unjustly treat you as someone who doesn't know enough or maybe even knows too much. We'll explain more what that means. But it's a kind of mix of morality, which we're going to be talking about ethics a bit soon, and epistemology, the theory of knowledge, in ways that you can um, be morally right or wrong in how you treat people as knowers. And it's written by Rachel McKinnon. So there are lots of ways that we can come to know things, and we've gotten into some of those. Um, One way is through testimony, right? So I might form a belief, and you'll recall with Gettier, one of the things that turns just any belief into knowledge, part of it is that it has to be justified, right? So again, if I just, might have true beliefs, I might have false beliefs, right? But even my true beliefs, that's not enough to count as knowledge, right? If I just have some random belief, but it happens to be true, but I don't have any justification or good reason for believing that, we wouldn't say I know it, right? If I just sort of guess who's going to win the Super Bowl, right? And maybe I even really believe it, but you wouldn't say I knew it unless I had some good reason, to think that that's how it would turn out. So that's the justification part. One of the ways your belief could be justified is testimony, right? So you're taking a lot of the things I say, right, as true because, um, you're believing what I say because I'm the professor and I went to school for these sorts of things. And we treat lots of people as a good source for knowledge. So if I ask my wife, hey, what's the weather going to be like today? And I see her look at her phone for a second and say, oh, it's going to be hot. I believe her, right? Now I've made a few leaps there. You know, um, that justification is based on there's a few gaps there, right? Descartes, for example, who wants to be a foundationalist and wants everything grounded, um, might find reason to doubt it. But for most everyday people, those are reasonable assumptions to make, right? I assume that when my wife looks at her phone, she's looking at the weather app, right? And when she's reporting accurately what she sees, I assume she's not just lying to me for no reason, right? Um, that's based on a lot of other things, what I know about her personality, my experience of her as a person. But we make those sorts of judgments all the time, and they can be perfectly good ways of knowing, right? If you know somebody, you know they're reliable in certain respects, and you know they're knowledgeable in certain respects, you can trust what they say, and that counts as a justification for knowledge, right? Also, there I'm trusting that the weather report is accurate too, right? But maybe I know or maybe I don't know exactly how my phone comes up with the weather. I assume somewhere there's a meteorologist, right, who has gone to school for this sort of thing that's making predictions. Um, but at any rate, testimony can be a good um, source for knowledge. When the source of the testimony is reliable, we say, yes, you're justified in your belief. And then if that belief turns out to be true, we say, yes, that's knowledge. Of course, we know from Gettier that that's not enough. We need some extra conditions, but it's a start at any rate, right? Good testimony, reliable testimony is a good justification for knowledge. Now, testimony can fail. Obviously, it's not foolproof, but these days, the way, Gettier and most modern philosophers define knowledge, that's fine, right? You can still know and you can still believe testimony can still be generally reliable even if it sometimes fails. So, if you ask a friend about what we covered in class or something and they make a mistake and tell you something wrong, that can happen, right? It doesn't mean that testimony isn't good for knowledge. But McKinnon wants to focus on a very specific way that testimony can fail. So sometimes we treat somebody as more reliable than they actually are, right? We trust our friends and they're actually kind of flaky and we get bad information. But another thing we sometimes do, and it sometimes happens to us, is we don't treat someone as reliable when they actually are reliable, right? And there have been scientific studies that show that people do systematically disbelieve otherwise reliable people when they belong to certain groups. So people tend to um, rate women as less reliable, right? Rating non-white people as less reliable. This has been shown. This is a bias, right? A certain prejudice that people have. They may not even be conscious of it. If you ask them, do you think women are as smart as men, or whatever, they would say yes. But then if you looked at their behavior, they might actually um, show that they don't, on some level, on some subconscious level, they don't quite trust the information that they're getting from women and or from other racial groups and so on, right? So this is the phenomenon that Rachel McKinnon wants to focus on, and she argues that this is a form of epistemic injustice. It's a immoral, unethical thing to treat someone as unreliable when they are not. Sorry, to treat someone as unreliable when they are reliable is what I want to say. So before she sort of explains this phenomenon, which I think once you get some examples, you'll say, "Oh yeah, that I can relate to that. I've heard of that's been done to me, or maybe I've done it in the past." This sort of epistemic injustice. But to treat it more formally, McKinnon wants to get more into the detail of when testimony counts as knowledge, and there's been lots of philosophical exploration of that topic, right? So many people have proposed sort of conditions of when is testimony sufficient for knowledge or sufficient for justification. So Lackey, another philosopher, claims that there's three conditions. So first of all, the testimony must be true. So again, I asked my wife, "Hey, well, what's the weather going to be like?" And if she says it's sunny, well, it better be sunny, right? If it doesn't turn out to be sunny, then that wasn't good testimony. I shouldn't have relied on it. Also, the person needs to be reliable, right? So if I just ask um, a stranger on the street, right, that looks like, uh, what's a good example? If I ask someone that's asleep, right, and they're just talking in their sleep, I say, "Hey, what's the weather going to be like?" And they say, "Oh, sunny." Okay, well, that person's not reliable in that moment, right? They're not conscious, they're not actually thinking, right? So that wouldn't, even if it turned out to be sunny, that wouldn't count as knowledge because uh, that person might have just as easily said rainy, right? They were just dreaming and they were just talking in their sleep. Um, and third part is the person receiving the testimony must believe them to be reliable. So that means that, again, I asked my wife, "What's the weather like?" She says it's going to be sunny. Okay, she needs to be reliable. What she says needs to be true. But also, for it to count as knowledge, I have to think that she's reliable, right? So if I assume that she's lying, then that's not going to count as knowledge either, right? So Lackey claims if these three conditions are satisfied, then the person receiving the testimony has knowledge, right? Testimony there counts as justification, and you have knowledge of the claim. Um, so this is the case with the weather report. It's also the case with my wife. They're saying true things. They're reliable sources, and I believe them to both be reliable. Right? So when my wife says it'll be hot today, I know it will be hot today. So notice the third condition was a credibility judgment, right? So the person has to not only be reliable, but I have to take them to be reliable for that to count as knowledge. If I don't think they're reliable, right, um, then we wouldn't say I know, right? Because even if they are a good source, if I don't think they're a good source, um, I wouldn't say that that's knowledge in my head, right? I have to sort of believe it to be coming from a good place, right? So it's in these credibility judgments where we judge whether someone's reliable or not, is where this epistemic injustice comes in, right? So what factors do people rely on when they rate someone as reliable or not, right? So if I ask a stranger on the street, "Hey, what time is it?" Um, what information would I use to determine whether I'm going to trust them as reliable or not, right? If they didn't even look at their watch, like if I say, "Hey, can you tell me what time it is?" And the person just says 3, and they don't even look at their watch or anything, I might not judge them to be reliable, right? Um, but there's also sorts of other things we sort of judge, do they look smart? Are they well dressed, right? There's all sorts of like subconscious or sort of conscious things that we maybe rely on people, right? If the person is homeless, do we not count them as reliable, right? Is that a kind of prejudice or is that a reasonable assumption, right? There's all sorts of stuff that goes on and we rate people's reliability, and um, a lot of it does kind of come from prejudice. So here, this is, I don't know if you know Morris Day and the Time. They're a band. They used to open for Prince and stuff. But this guy, obviously reliable on the subject of time, right? He has got a lot of clocks and he seems very interested in time. So I would rate Morris Day as reliable if I asked him what time it was, right? But maybe other people under other conditions, I might not, right? So lots of studies have shown that these credibility judgments can go wrong, right? People that are credible, that are reliable, are not treated as good sources for knowledge, right? Um, for example, on average, people attribute more credibility to a white man than to a black woman, right? Even if the latter is objectively more credible, right? Certainly there are certain subjects, right, that Kamala Harris is more expert in than Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump is, real estate developer. He was president for a while. Kamala Harris was an attorney, so on certain things she's going to be more credible. But if you poll people, often they tend to favor the white guy, right? Um, and there's lots of examples of these sorts of things in the scientific literature. It's not just women. It's not just based on race, but those are common. So there's actually two ways that a credibility judgment can go wrong, right? Um, Someone can be perceived as less credible than they actually are, or they can be perceived as more credible than they actually are. So the first kind we can call a credibility deficit, and again, the literature tends to show that, for example, women tend to get a credibility deficit as far as how reliable they are epistemically, right, as far as knowers. Um, and men tend to get a credibility excess, right? They get too much credibility. So let's focus on the credibility deficit, right? So again, I ask a if I ask someone, right, if I ask Kamala Harris a question about the law, right, and as an attorney and a DA, I think she was, right, um, he answers, or she was Attorney General, I think, of California. At any rate, and she answers the question, and I don't believe her, even though she's definitely qualified, then she, I've she's got a credibility deficit there, right? And that's my fault, right? And we would call that testimonial injustice or epistemic injustice, right? So Rachel McKinnon is saying, when you don't believe someone, when you don't trust their testimony, even when you should, then that is injustice in some way, right? So she points out as a sort of at a meta level, um, this phenomenon has actually already been discussed in the literature by feminist writers and women of color and didn't really get a lot of uh, recognition until white writers like Rachel McKinnon wrote about it, right? So this in itself is a form of epistemic injustice when people that know things and are pointing out things that exist um, don't get the credibility that they deserve. So again, testimonial injustice occurs when someone is wronged specifically in their capacity as a knower, right? So it's an injustice that applies to people in terms of their ability as knowers. Um, Now, interestingly, I'll leave it open to you. Maybe this is something you write a paper on. Um, she talks about people being wronged, and then she moves into people being harmed, and those are slightly different things depending, I guess, on how you define harm, right? So I could say it's wrong to not believe someone. I think it's another question whether I've harmed them by not believing them. I can imagine situations where that you might call it harm, but um, it would depend on the details, I would think. But I don't know. I try to point out interesting points where somebody might want to dig in and see if there's something controversial there they could write a paper on. So McKinnon kind of develops an example of epistemic injustice from a book. They also made a movie of it, several movies of it, called The Talented Mr. Ripley. So what happens in that book is a con man fools everyone sort of in his, friend group, whatever, into blaming someone else for a murder he committed, right? And the only person who actually suspects him is the victim, the person he murders' fiance, right? But no one believes her. So she thinks this Ripley guy killed her fiance, and no one believes her, right? And so here's, some quotes from other people in the movie who say, Marge, that's the name of the woman, there's female intuition and then there's facts, right? So they're saying, oh, as a woman, you're going from your gut or your instincts, but they're just not aligning with the facts. You don't really know, right? Um, and she even at some point in the book finds evidence, right? She's like, here is hard evidence, but still no one believes her, right? So this is an example of testimonial injustice, right? This woman does know, she even has evidence, and she's discounted as a knower. She's given a credibility deficit. Another example of epistemic injustice occurs in the book, and again, there's a film as well, To Kill a Mockingbird. So I think usually most people have read this in high school. Hopefully you've read it. But the basic story is Tom Robinson, he's a black man in 1935 in Alabama, and he's wrongly accused of rape. And so in the trial, um, there he's asked, "Hey, well, why were you hanging out with this woman? He was doing work for her for free. He was doing all this help for her, and it seemed suspicious to people. And they ask him, why were you hanging around? Why are you doing all this stuff for her? He says, well, I felt sorry for her. Well, in that climate, right, in the South in 1935, it was inconceivable that a black man could feel sorry for a white woman, right? Um, and for that reason, his credibility in the trial suffers, right? And he doesn't quite get a fair trial because no one believes him. McKinnon said this is also an example of testimonial injustice, right? He's just reporting his own feelings, what he thought and what he believed. He felt sorry for this woman and he was helping her, and no one believes him, right? Um, so again, Mr. Ripley in the other story, right? The murderer, he had a credibility excess, right? And the lawyers who are trying to convict uh, Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird are getting a credibility excess, and then the wife and in The Talented Mr. Ripley, and then Tom Robinson and To Kill a Mockingbird are getting a credibility deficit. So in both cases, these are epistemic justice, right? Not um, giving someone the credit that they deserve as a knower of things. And in the Tom Robinson case, a knower of, his own thoughts. This has been demonstrated in doctors as well. Have been shown not to necessarily believe the pain reports of people of color as much as they do of white people. So, someone will say, I'm in pain. I need a prescription, and they won't quite believe or they won't quite prescribe enough. This happens as well, which is interesting because again, that's a report of your own. If anybody knows who's in pain, if you're in pain, it would be you, and yet believed, right? So then McKinnon wants to point out another kind of epistemic injustice. It's a little broader. She calls it hermeneutical injustice, which kind of a big word. Um, so what this form of justice is sort of a broader resistance by a whole society to accept the knowledge that marginalized groups have. And her example here is the concept of sexual harassment, for example. So this is a relatively new concept, a relatively new term. That word didn't exist like 50 years ago, right? And that's not that sexual harassment didn't happen back then, um, but only really women knew about it or understood it, right? Um, so in the public mind, there was rape, which was obviously a crime and immoral, um, but there just wasn't a concept for the sort of thing that goes on, for example, in the workplace, where people make demeaning comments or sort of leer, stare, comment on your um, clothes, or keep hitting on you, trying to ask you out, touch inappropriately. Um, Now we know that as sexual harassment, it didn't exist as a concept except among the women who were experiencing it, right? So um, that's what she calls hermeneutical injustice, right? When the broader society doesn't accept um, concept or a kind of a general idea that a marginalized group does understand and is trying to bring to the attention of the larger group. So in a in-person class, this is a great, I think usually most everyone has experienced this in some way and now they have a name for it, right? So um, uh, we're not in person, but I'll ask you to sort of think about, have you ever experienced epistemic justice or epistemic injustice, right? Have you ever been treated, examples might be, if you're a woman and you're bringing your car into the mechanic and you're trying to explain what's wrong with it, um, is has the mechanic ever decided treated you like you don't know anything about cars, right? Something like that. Um, people get it from their parents too. Just younger people get from older people. Think, oh, you don't know how to do this or that, right? Oh, you let me do that for you. You don't understand. Um, so I think everyone has experienced this at some point, right? Because even, if nothing else, as a young person, right, you've had parents and older people treating you like you don't know when you know. And then many of us are from, groups that have been marginalized. You know, I myself, I often get a credibility excess, right? Um, I notice that when if I walk into a classroom, with my gray beard and my bag, people kind of assume, oh, he must be the professor. He must know what he's doing, right? But I've seen um, colleagues of mine that were younger or women, something, walk into a class and the class kind of acts up a little bit, and they don't really give them the kind of respect that I sort of get automatically. You know what I mean? Just from the way I look. So, uh, take a moment to think about it. See if you've ever experienced this. Maybe you've done it to other folks, and so on. Um, and I think that's it for now. Right? But we'll see you next time. Thanks.